All right, let's talk about something that can feel, well, a little uncomfortable. We're going to tackle a big question. Why do we sometimes just fail to connect with what other people are going through? It's a phenomenon called the empathy gap. And trust me, it's way more common than you might think.
So let's just start with a really honest question for yourself. Have you ever felt that tiny little secret thrill when a rival, a competing sports team, a colleague at work, maybe even a political opponent, stumbles and fails?
Yeah, if that sounds at all familiar, you are definitely not alone. That feeling actually has a name. Schadenfreude. It's this weird little pleasure we sometimes get from someone else's misfortune, and it's actually our way into a much, much bigger idea.
So that feeling, that little bit of schadenfreude, it's a perfect example of what researchers call an empathy gap. So what exactly is that?
Basically, an empathy gap is a breakdown in our ability to connect. It's that moment when we just fail to understand or share what someone's feeling, especially in a situation where you'd kind of expect empathy. And this is super important. This isn't about being a bad person. Not at all. It's a fundamental psychological thing that happens to all of us. It helps to think about empathy as having two different flavors. A gap can happen in our thinking. That's called a cognitive gap. That's when we fail to see something from their perspective. Or it can happen in our feelings, an affective gap, where we just don't feel their emotion along with them. And you can totally have one without the other. And get this, these gaps don't just happen between us and other people. That's called an interpersonal gap. They can also happen inside our own heads, an intrapersonal gap. I mean, think about it. You ever promise yourself you're going to eat healthy, but then you completely underestimate how starving you'll be after work? That's you failing to empathize with your future self.
But for this explainer, we're really going to focus on those interpersonal gaps. And one of the biggest drivers of them is that powerful, hardwired feeling of us versus them. The research here is just undeniable. We are fundamentally wired to feel way more empathy for people who we see as part of our in-group and a whole lot less for those we see as outsiders.
There's this famous study that just nails this point perfectly. So, researchers watched soccer fans to see if they'd help an injured stranger. Now, when the person who needed help was wearing their team's jersey, fans jumped in to help almost immediately. But when the injured person was wearing a rival team's jersey, crickets. They were so much less likely to help. The only thing that changed was a piece of fabric that screamed outgroup.
And this loops us right back to Schadenfreude. Research shows that the two things that most strongly predict whether you'll feel that little thrill of pleasure are, 1, how strongly you identify with your own group, and 2, if there's a sense of competition. The more intense those feelings are, the more likely you are to enjoy a rival's failure.
Okay, but why? Why do our brains even do this? Well, to understand that, we gotta peek under the hood and look at the mental shortcuts and the automatic processes that are happening inside our minds. See, our minds are built to be efficient, to save energy by taking shortcuts. One is called mind attribution. When we see an outsider, we're just less likely to give them the same rich, complex inner life that we automatically give to people in our own circle. Another is episodic simulation. This just means we find it a lot harder to vividly imagine the specific details of an outsider's life from their point of view. And here's the wild part. This isn't just some abstract psychological theory. It is something you can literally see happening in the brain. The physical wiring, the processing itself, is different depending on who we're looking at. For instance, there's a part of the brain called the DMPFC. Its whole job is mentalizing, thinking about other people's thoughts and feelings. Well, brain scans show that this area lights up like a Christmas tree when we think about people in our own group. We are literally spending more brain power thinking about us than them.
But it gets even crazier. What happens when we see an outsider in pain? The brain regions that fire up when we feel pain, the ones that kind of create a simulation of what they're going through, show way less activity. It's like our brain just turns down the volume on their suffering.
So we know this is a universal human tendency, right? But does it affect everyone equally? Well, research shows that certain personality traits and even social norms can make these empathy gaps either wider or narrower. Now, studies have found correlations, and I want to stress these are correlations between lower empathy and a few specific traits. These include something called social dominance orientation, which is basically the belief that group hierarchies are natural and good.
They also include higher social class and, specifically among non-religious individuals, a more conservative political orientation. Another finding that pops up again and again in self-report studies is a gender difference. On average, women tend to report higher levels of empathy than men. But this is where the story gets really, really interesting. So the key question researchers are asking is this: is this a fundamental difference in ability, or is it really about motivation? I mean, are men less able to feel empathy, or are they maybe just less motivated to show it because of social pressures and norms? You're not going to believe this. One study made this self-reported gender gap completely vanish. So how'd they do it? It was shockingly simple. Researchers just told the male participants that being highly empathetic was a sign of competence and high status. And boom, just like that, their reported empathy scores shot right up to match the women's. This really suggests that motivation, shaped by what society tells us is important, is a huge, huge factor here. Okay, so we've seen how our brains are wired for these gaps and how society can shape them. But why does any of this really matter? Well, because the real-world consequences are profound. I mean, these gaps lead directly to less helping behavior. It's the reason why the story of one single, identifiable victim moves us to action, but a statistic about thousands of people just doesn't hit the same way. It contributes to serious burnout in tough jobs like medicine, and it absolutely fuels prejudice, making it easier to ignore complaints or oppose social programs for groups we see as other. So the crucial thing to take away from all this is simple. The empathy gap is not a moral failing. This is not about being a good or a bad person. It's a deep-seated feature of our cognitive wiring. You could almost think of it as an old survival mechanism that can seriously misfire in our modern, interconnected world. Look, the first step to overcoming any kind of bias is just knowing that it exists. So I'll leave you with this question. Now that you know this empathy gap is sort of a default setting in all of our brains, what's maybe one small, conscious choice you could make today to start bridging it?